Hey there, Ryan Reynolds here. It's a new year, and you know what that means. No, not the diet. Resolutions. A way for us all to try and do a little bit better than we did last year. And my resolution, unlike big wireless, is to not be a raging and raise the price of wireless on you every chance I get. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment required, equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes on unlimited. See mintmobile.com for details.
This episode is brought to you by Amazon. Sometimes the most painful part of getting sick is the getting better part. Waiting on hold for an appointment, sitting in crowded waiting rooms, standing in line at the pharmacy. That's painful. Amazon One Medical and Amazon Pharmacy remove those painful parts of getting better with things like 24/7 virtual visits and prescriptions delivered to your door. Thanks to Amazon Pharmacy and Amazon One Medical, healthcare just got less painful.
Atheists, agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Northern Kentucky University political scientist Michael Baranowski. My guest today is Kurt Gray, a professor in psychology and neuroscience at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where he directs the Deepest Beliefs Lab and the Center for the Science of Moral Understanding. He's also the author of the recently released book, Outraged, Why We Fight About Morality in Politics and How to Find Common Ground, which we'll be discussing today. Kurt Gray, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So I wanted to start by doing something a little bit different by talking about someone else's book, but I think it's important because I think it should set sort of the foundation for talking about your work, because back in 2012, Jonathan Haidt published a book called The Righteous Mind. And in that, he argued that there are these 6 basic foundations of morality, and that basically that liberals and conservatives oftentimes have trouble talking to each other because they emphasize different foundations or different aspects of these foundations. For instance, liberals tend to focus more on what Haidt calls the care, harm, fairness, cheating, and liberty oppression foundations, at least liberty oppression when applied to marginalized groups. And then you have conservatives who are more likely to emphasize loyalty betrayal, authority subversion, purity degradation, and liberty oppression when it comes to, you might call it government overreach, I guess. And so that's a super capsule summary, but I know that you are really familiar with Jonathan Haidt's work. You cite him a lot in the book. So I was hoping you could give me a sense of what you think he gets right or not so right. It's kind of a way to move into your book.
Yeah, it's a great question. And obviously, research, thinking, ideas, they always follow what's before them. And so in a sense, I owe a debt of gratitude to John and his ideas, but certainly, as you can see in the book, I definitely don't agree with the kind of deep idea of these moral foundations or liberals and conservatives having different moral minds. But what I think John gets right about, liberals versus conservatives is, I think, something that folks have known for quite a long time. And that is that, different languages, different kind of keywords and key phrases emerge out of cultures and out of subcultures. So what I mean by that is, if I tell you about there's a Liberty Caucus on the Hill, then you think, oh, I know that. That leans right. And if I tell you there is a Freedom Caucus, same thing. But if I tell you there's a Social Justice Caucus, well, now you know that leans left, right? And so I like how you mentioned that it's about talking to each other, because this is really about explicit language. And this is what I think John really captured. I don't think he thinks this, but what he really captured is just the words and the phrases that people use. And a lot of the work on moral foundations theory kind of analyzes people's speeches, analyzes online content. So that's what I think he gets kind of right. I'm happy to go to what he gets wrong now, or happy to talk more. What do you think?
Well, it seems to me, in a way, when I was reading your book, I felt like I was reading it through the lens of moral foundations theory, simply because I'm fairly familiar with that. I've used The Righteous Mind in my classes in the past. And so it seemed to me that your theory, you focus on perceived harm. But when I was thinking about sort of that in light of moral foundations, those categories, I felt like kind of all of them could sort of fit into that. And in a way, it felt to me like you were tapping into something that might be more basic, more fundamental than moral foundations. I don't know. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
That's 100% right. And so part of my motivation for kind of studying this was looking at the kind of like deeper cognition underlying our moral judgments. So I think John did a great job, coming from an anthropology kind of perspective. And his advisor, Rick Schwader, was a social anthropologist who went over to India to look at different categories of morality. And so I think John nicely captures those kind of categories. But again, I think they're relatively superficial. They're categories of social discourse. And I think if you dig deeper into the mind, then you don't see these categories as separate. You don't see them really at all. And, I could talk inside baseball for an hour about how these are not really foundations at all. And liberals and conservatives don't really differ on these values. I mean, liberals care a lot about loyalty if it's about loyalty to unions and solidarity, right? I mean, so I think if you dig deeper, there's not really these kind of differences in foundations, and that what there really is this shared concern about protecting ourselves and our society from harm. And that's not to say there's not differences out there, and we can talk about them when it comes to morality and perceptions of harm. But you're right. Everything kind of boils down to concerns and perceptions of harm, of suffering, not just physical harm, not just physical, emotional harm, like the Care Harm Foundation quote, but really this kind of like broader sense of harm and victimization.
And there's an important role, at least you would argue, there's an important role that evolutionary history of human beings plays into this, right?
That's right. That's right. And I think, thinking of the arguments I make in the book as a whole, we kind of tackle three myths that we frequently believe and that kind of lead us to misunderstand our moral divides. One of those myths is that there are harmless wrongs. That's something that John argues for. I think it's not true. I think everything we see as wrong, we see as harmful. But I think the myth kind of underlying these things is the myth of human nature. And that is that we as humans evolved more as predators than prey. And I think, there's lots of movies, lots of kind of pop ideas that paint us as kind of predators, out on the prowl. It's based on some anthropological work a century ago that actually is not true. I was wrong. And so if you really look at the evidence, humans deep in the past evolved more as prey than as predators, kind of constantly on the lookout for wild animals. Today, it's not, actual predators, it's moral predators. That white panel van, we don't think it's a locksmith who's lost in our neighborhood, right? We think it's a kidnapper looking for our kids. And so because we evolved as prey, we're always on the lookout for harm. We're always on the lookout for what's going to victimize us. And that kind of draw a dotted line from millions of years ago to today is why we're so worried about harm and suffering and why our moral minds are built around concerns about victimization.
Now, I can hear some people saying, well, okay, sure, but saying that all humans sort of fundamentally care about perceived harm or potential perceived harm, it's such a broad thing. It's almost like a truism, and so it's not really useful. But I want to point out that that's not where you leave things. That's kind of where you start. And then as you drill down, you suggest that there are these four basic clusters, categories when it comes to what you call assumptions of vulnerability. And those are the environment, the divine, the powerful, and the other. And I was hoping you'd kind of take us through how you came up with these categories and what they all involve.
I have to. And I think it's right? So if you say, look, everything in our morals is built around perceptions of harm. I mean, John Haidt himself has argued, well, it kind of drains the color or the richness from our kind of like moral debates. And I think that's not true because you can look to see at the themes that we disagree about about who or what is especially vulnerable to suffering. And I think this is actually a more hopeful and useful idea than the idea that, we're fundamentally divided by these foundations that one side could never understand, because we can all understand perceptions of harm. And so if one side makes a different assumptions about vulnerability than us, then we still have the kind of like hardware. We still have the way to make sense of those different assumptions because we too care about harm. So I think it's a deeply hopeful idea. But you're right. So there's different clusters that kind of underlie our moral divides. And I want to say, I don't think that they are foundational in the way that John talks about it. I'm not saying that they're little rooms in our mind, little boxes.
Yeah.
And they're kind of like ad hoc themes, right? That it just so happens that disagreement swirls around. So I'm not introducing, additional foundations. But so these four clusters, right? The environment, it's just what it sounds like. So coral reefs, the planet Earth. Liberals are more likely to think of these things as especially vulnerable to victimization, to mistreatment than conservatives, right? Explaining why liberals are more likely to want to protect the rainforests. It's not that conservatives also want to harm the rainforest. I want to point that out, but just that when there's trade-offs here between, let's say, protecting American sovereignty from protecting American sovereignty from foreign countries, conservatives are more likely to want to drill to protect ourselves, and we're less concerned about the environment, if that makes sense. So it's all about these trade-offs. Another category is the
divine was the second one that I mentioned there.
That's right. Sorry. Second category is the divine. And so here's a category, unlike the environment, where progressives are more likely to see entities as vulnerable. Conservatives are more likely to see Jesus, God, the Bible as being especially vulnerable to harm, to suffering. And so if you light a Bible on fire, let's say, progressives might say, okay, well, it's mostly just a book. Conservatives, on the other hand, will see some kind of legitimate suffering there. Not as much as, hurting a kid, but will still infer some real kind of harm caused in that action. But I think you get the most purchase for explaining hot button moral debates with the last two categories you mentioned. The othered, these are folks who are outside the center of American society, like trans folks, undocumented immigrants, Muslims. You could call them marginalized groups, but I think there's some argument over who's really marginalized by liberals versus conservatives. And so I think we can all agree that these folks are othered in the sense that they are not, white middle-class folks that most Americans think as Americans, right? And then the powerful are folks who are state troopers, corporate leaders, CEOs, right? So now you've got these kind of two groups, right? The powerful and the othered, and everyone agrees that the othered are generally more vulnerable to victimization than the powerful. It's almost kind of inherent in what it means to be othered versus powerful. But there's really big differences between, how much more vulnerable are the other than the powerful, depending on your politics. So if you are highly progressive, the distance between the vulnerability of the othered and the powerful is huge. You see the othered as incredibly vulnerable to harm, oppressed, really. They need protection. They need all the protections you can muster. Versus the powerful, you think they're completely invulnerable to harm, right? You're not worried about the police at all. You're not worried about CEOs at all. And so the assassination of a healthcare CEO, for instance, right? That's not real harm in the same way that, harming a poor Muslim or a poor trans person might be, right? They're really different categories in the minds of a committed progressive. On the other hand, if you are a committed conservative, then the distance between these groups, the other and the powerful, is very small. And in fact, you really see the world more as kind of individuals. And so it doesn't matter whether you're a police officer or, a young black man who was pulled over by that police officer, right? If you're a conservative, you see these folks as relatively equally vulnerable to harm. And so you are concerned about each of them suffering. And so if you think of something like Black Lives Matter, well, that's really something where progressives believe in, because it's Black lives are really the focus of concern much more than the police. But if you think of something like All Lives or Blue Lives Matter, the conservative kind of movement, then you're more concerned about everyone suffering, and especially more powerful folks who are, trying to enforce social order. And so you really get the kind of an explanation for why all these social justice issues are making people so angry. It's because of these different assumptions of vulnerability.
I feel like I'm pretty clear on how this applies to left-wing folks, maybe because I'm one of them, and so it just tracks for me really well. But when I think about, for instance, right-wing populist folks, it almost feels like they're the ones who are arguing that they're being marginalized and they're the othered ones who are being the country, their country is being taken away from them and so forth. And can you give me a sense of how those folks might fit in here, if you can get what I'm saying?
Yeah, I get it. And I think they do feel like they are more marginalized and vulnerable than the current media, than progressives think. I think if we ask them, they don't think of themselves as necessarily more vulnerable to suffering than, someone from a marginalized group like a poor Black single mom. But they do think of themselves as much more vulnerable than the media is giving them credit for, if that makes sense. And so, like, look, we've talking all these things about, let's say, affirmative action, right? Like we're talking about how these African-American folks, from the legacy of slavery, don't enjoy the same amount of opportunities that white folks do in society today. They'll say, what about the suffering that I endure, working hard and trying to support my family and, getting sick, and, no one's concerned about my suffering. So I think they're not, fully discounting the suffering of other folks, but they're thinking I'm much more vulnerable than I get credit for. And so stopping affirmative action makes a lot of sense from the point of view of these kind of more conservative populist folks, because they think, look, if my kid doesn't get into college, they're just as sad as if a kid from a marginalized group doesn't get into college, right? All our suffering is suffering. All tears are tears, right? And so why should one group get an advantage over me if my suffering is just as valid as someone else's suffering?
Right, yeah. Another thing I found interesting is your argument that you're finding that liberals tend to amplify group differences, whereas conservatives dampen these differences on average. Can you kind of explain what that means in a little more detail and what the implications of that are in your view?
Yeah, so I think this is really what's at the heart of a progressive versus conservative when it comes to our harm, based moral minds. And that conservatives, if you think about, Jefferson, who really thinks of us all as kind of equal and as born equal and as all making kind of our own life choices, right? That's a kind of conservative, individualistic ethos where if you think about victimization and suffering, it's about the individual level. So as I mentioned, right, if we all can suffer, if each of us is, cut with a knife, we all bleed the same, we all feel the same pain. And so the conservatives kind of emphasize how individually victimization is all identical in a sense. Whereas progressives, they emphasize that questions of who is more likely to be victimized are really grounded in group identity. And so progressive says, sure, we can all suffer equally if we're cut, but some groups are more likely to suffer than others. And so, we can argue whether extreme progressives go too far in putting kind of questions of victimization and vulnerability at the group level versus the individual level. And certainly conservatives do argue that. But I think this is what's driving it, right? Is it group-based victimization or is it individual victimization? And I think this drives a lot of the social justice debates between progressives and conservatives in America today.
What's your sense of how sort of deep this runs, or how kind of hardwired is? I remember a few years ago, maybe it's longer than that, I'm old, but a while back, there was a few books that came out about how conservatives' brains are different than liberals and that sort of thing. I mean, because if these things are just kind of built in or baked into us, and it would suggest it's pretty hard to change them. What's your sense of that?
I mean, I think it's severely overestimated how much our brains are different. It's even hard to show real differences between liberals and conservatives in our minds, except in the most obvious way, which is, and I think this goes back to John Haidt's work as well. I mean, just the fact that someone identifies as liberal versus conservative is a difference, right? I mean, that is a different political ideology. And so there's a sense of course, there's a difference because you're going to identify as one way or the other, right? Like that term, liberal conservative, taps something, but it doesn't tap this kind of really deep, different basis of your moral judgment. And so you could think of it as maybe like a subculture, like if you visited India or you visited England, people would act different. They have different norms. They have different judgments about, should you show up to a party on time? But it doesn't mean that fundamentally they have different minds. And I think that's important because if we're trying to get along with someone on the other side, then saying that someone has a different kind of moral mind, and I think this is what Moral Foundations actually does that's very dangerous, argues that someone has a lesser morality. So, the argument that liberals are somehow lesser when it comes to morality, have fewer moral foundations. I think that's really dangerous because it's saying, well, this side's less moral than my side. And that's really an invitation for dehumanization and, prejudice. So I don't think it goes that deep.
This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. The new year brings new health goals and wealth goals. Protecting your identity is an important step. LifeLock monitors millions of data points per second. If your identity is stolen, LifeLock's restoration specialist will fix it, guaranteed or your money back. Resolve to make identity health and wealth part of your New Year's goals with LifeLock. Save up to 40% your first year. Visit LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
You mentioned dehumanization. I wanted to ask you about that because in the book, you write that dehumanization is one of the most powerful drivers of any moral conflict. And so I was hoping you could talk about what makes it so very powerful.
Well, if you think about, how we give moral rights to each other or even to something like animals, right? So if you think about, well, why can't you torture puppies, to use a very obvious example? Well, because puppies feel pain, right? Because they can suffer and we feel bad for them suffering and having kind of mental lives. Or why can't we enslave other people? Well, because they have desires and hopes and dreams and can suffer, right? I mean, these are all kind of mental states, right? That animate people, animate animals. And when we recognize those, we realize that other people, other creatures deserve moral rights. And so when we don't recognize those things, when we dementalize other people and we dehumanize them because our minds are really essential to being human, then we strip people of their moral rights. I mean, every example of kind of genocide from around the world through history is really driven forward by dehumanization, right? Seeing the other side as vermin, as cockroaches, as not really having the same emotions as you or me as the dominant group. And so I think we really need to resist this idea of dehumanization and dementalization when we're trying to, bridge divides across a divided America.
And it seems to me increasingly that's been more difficult. And when I think about dehumanization, I think Donald Trump pops into mind because it seems to me he's excellent at this. His rhetoric is just full of dehumanizing language, especially directed towards immigrants, but really all of his political opponents tend to come up for some of it. And it's not like other politicians on both sides don't do this and haven't done this for years, but it feels to me like this is this is something very different, and it's been picked up by more folks, I think, because it seems to me it's so effective. Do you get a sense that we've been seeing more of those more of this in the last 8 to 10 years or so because of this?
I think a lot of populist movements really are driven forward by dehumanization, right? Like, you feel like you are not getting your just desserts in society, and you don't feel like you're taken seriously. You don't think you're treated fairly. And so you want to pick a scapegoat. And then the way you scapegoat others is by dehumanizing them, right? And the way you license harm is to dehumanize them. So I think we are seeing a rise in this. I mean, we frequently, dehumanize the outgroup. Other nations, for instance, in the Second World War, right? We dehumanized Japan, and Japan dehumanized America. But I think the rise of dehumanizing other Americans, like recent immigrants, for instance, is troubling and, right, is an easy thing to do if you want to create division in America. So there's a journalist named Amanda Ripley. She talks about conflict entrepreneurs, not just, politicians, but also media elites, right? Really kind of make money out of driving discord. And I think a really easy way to do that, as you mentioned, is dehumanize some other group within our country.
Yeah, and I want to be clear. I certainly agree that happens on both sides of the aisle. And this happened, I think, like you said, it tends to be, I associate it with populist movements, both left and right there. But, you also mentioned these conflict entrepreneurs. And it seems to me that technology has created an environment that allows these folks to thrive like never before. I'm old enough to remember a pre-social media, pre-smartphone world where it didn't feel to me like outrage culture was as huge as it is today and has been for at least the last decade. And I'm wondering, how much of a role do you feel that the online world and particularly social media and these kind of algorithms that we're all sucked into, how much does it play in kind of driving these sort of things that make it harder for us to talk to each other or seem to make the other side we're kind of causing potential harm to us?
It definitely plays a role, and I think a big role. There's lots of research out there arguing that, our online world, social media, these algorithms, they really, inspire us to be more outraged. I mean, in one hand, it's the, recent iteration of an ongoing trend, which is the kind of segregation of media environments, right? So way back in the day, you'd watch NBC or ABC or CBS News, and that'd be it. And then we got CNN and Fox News, right? So we've been kind of going further and further apart in our media ecosystems. But obviously the problem now with social media is that algorithms are picking content that inspires outrage and reinforcing that. And we've actually done some research on this, on moral panics. And, moral panics have been around forever, like reefer madness, Dungeons and Dragons, leading kids to Satan. These are all not true. Dungeons and Dragons didn't convert many kids to Satanists, as far as I know, at least. I owned some of those books as a kid, and I don't worship Satan today. But, yeah, right. But, I think what you need for a moral panic, and this goes back to some old sociology work, is you need a threat, and then you need social proof that not only is the threat real, but also that people are worried about this threat, right? And I often think of of Godzilla movies, right? Like, you need to hear the roar, in a sense, of Godzilla, and then you need to see everyone running panic down the street towards you. And those two things together, right, really create this kind of moral panic, right? If you see everyone running towards you and you hear the roar, then you also panic. And so social media is basically the perfect, Godzilla movie in a sense, because you see the threat. Algorithms give you threats every minute of every day, right? The world is burning, this person's out to get you. I don't, there's Chinese spies in your basement. Like, you just pick it, right? There's going to be a threat every time you open social media. And then there are clear signals that everyone's panicking about it. And those are virality metrics, right? There's literally a number underneath the threat that says, 40,000 people are retweeting this, whatever, right? And so now you think, oh my goodness, everyone's worried about it. And so the way that we've evolved in society to kind of combat these threats, if you can't run down the street and scream, is to be morally outraged and try to motivate other people to get upset about it and condemn it. Well, it turns out, that's exactly what drives virality. And so you've got this cycle, right? Like, you see it go viral, you get outraged, other people get outraged, and they have a full-blown moral panic every day, which is crazy, right? Reefer Madness happened, took 1 decade, D&D took 1 decade, but now this happens every day.
Yeah. It seems to me this is tied or somewhat tied into another concept you talk about in the book called moral typecasting, where I feel like there's this idea that we can't, or it's increasingly difficult for many of us to accept that people are complex and aren't necessarily all good or all bad, that basically not a lot of nuance anymore. And I'm wondering if you think this is, in fact, more of a problem than it has been, say, in the last, previous decades.
Yeah. I mean, maybe yes and no. The human mind is great at simplifying it, right? People don't like complicated things. This is not a dig against our psychology. It's just we have to simplify the world in order to navigate through it, right? There's so much complexity out there. We just divide the world into easy categories. And morality is very powerfully that way, right? We like superhero movies where the villains are very obvious and the heroes are also very obvious. These are the kind of things we teach our kids. And so when it comes to the moral world, we're used to simplifying it. And my work has revealed that we're used to simplifying it in a I think, an interesting way, which is that, we see people as either 100% villains or 100% victims, right? It's nicer, it's simpler to see the world as either, you are fully blameworthy and you can't suffer because that's what a victim does, or you're 100%, suffering and you can't be blamed. So I think of a supervillain. You don't think of them as being sad. In the book I talk about, no one ever thinks of Hitler's inner pain.
Yeah.
And fair enough, I say immediately, right? He was evil, obviously, but, Hitler was also abused as a kid. And, we don't think about that because obviously he did incredibly evil things. And at the same time, if you think of a poor orphan who's suffering, you don't think about that orphan's capacity for evil. And perhaps they are evil sometimes because they have suffered, right? So we've got these villains versus victims in our minds. And it, drives all sorts of interesting behavior. But I do think it's probably more likely that we project those ideas onto the world through social media because other people are held at an arm's length, right? We only see them in text. We only see them in little tweets, and we don't actually talk to them. We don't actually see people's complexity. And so I think the less that we actually have conversations with people, the more likely we are to typecast them.
Yeah. I mean, I can really relate to this because at times I'll talk about Donald Trump and I'll say, I really kind of feel sorry for the guy because it feels like his life is just so, in so many ways, so unfulfilled and sad, and he seems so desperate for, that sort of thing. And whether I'm right or not about that, the reaction I tend to get from the left is like, oh my God, would you just shut up, Mike? Donald Trump is just an evil bastard, essentially. I'm like, well, I don't like him. But I guess that's the kind of thing. And it's just frustrating, especially because this is, we try to bring left and right together. And it just is, it feels like we're really, swimming upstream to try to get some folks, to at least, a larger group of people to say, well, wait a second, maybe Donald Trump isn't 100% evil 100% of the time, or maybe, whatever, I don't know, AOC or something like that the same way. And that's why I want to get into what we can do about this, because I think that's, you said earlier that you're actually, your view is more hopeful than, say, what maybe moral foundations theory would suggest. So one of the things you mentioned in the book is that sharing personal stories of harm can be a more effective way of sort of communicating across this ideological divide than throwing facts at people, essentially. I was hoping you could kind of get into a little more detail on that. We could talk about that.
You bet. And so, part of the work that I do in my lab and the center that I run is about finding the best way to bridge divides. And part of that is trying to figure out how people think and act when it comes to bridging divides. And so we ran this study. We asked hundreds of people, a representative sample. Imagine you're having a conversation with someone on the other side. What should they talk about in that conversation to make you respect them? What do people say? Well, the majority of people said, I want the facts. Just give me the facts, the cold, hard truth, no editorializing, and I will respect someone on the other side. And we said, great, here are the facts. And then people said, well, not those facts. Those are not real facts, right?
Yeah.
And so people think they want the facts. And then when you give it to them, they think those are fake facts. And so, again, going back to what we talked about earlier about kind of different media ecosystems, we're living in kind of different realities with different facts. And so facts do not have the kind of weight or currency we think they do. And so unfortunately, right, maybe we've always been in a kind of post-fact mindset, right? I mean, I don't know if you've ever taught statistics to undergrads.
Oh, God.
But, right, it's real hard. It's real hard to teach statistics to undergrads. Our minds evolved to think about stories. And with politics, where we're disagreeing about facts and statistics, that's even more correct today. And so it turns out the best way to bridge divides, we found, is by sharing personal experiences, sharing your own stories, right? Those seem truer than some kind of facts you heard on NPR or something. And in particular, personal stories that revolve around some kind of vulnerability or suffering that you've experienced. So I give you an example of a study we ran. It's one of these, classic social psychology studies with an accomplice who's pretending to be another person. We're on campus. This research assistant, she's a young woman. She's pretending to walk around. We find another passerby, maybe like a parent or an alumni who's coming back. And we say, oh, look, you're, two of you together. Isn't this interesting, right? We'd love you to have a conversation about morality. And then the passerby, says, okay, I've got a couple of minutes. We say, great. You're going to talk about guns and gun rights. And the accomplice always takes the opposite stance, which is usually pro-gun rights, because the passerby, like the alumni, is often pro-gun control. And so, the passerby says, look, I'm kind of pro-gun control. And then the accomplice says, I don't know how anyone can think that. Frankly, that's un-American. And here's why I think that. Right. So really kind of let's get an argument here. And then either says, here's a statistic about how many times people use handguns to defend themselves in America every year. Or here's a story. My mom once used a gun to defend herself from a home intruder. We record those conversations, and then we have another team of research assistants rate those conversations for how respectful they are. And what we find is that when the accomplice uses that story, conversations are much more respectful. They're treated as much more rational than when they use a statistic, right? Because even if we disagree with someone's moral stance, we can always, make sense of the desire to protect ourselves. Again, going back to this, idea that we have a harm-based mind, that we're concerned about threats. When someone makes that clear to us, that they're worried about threats and acting to prevent that, then that seems rational and we can afford them some respect.
Yeah, it's interesting to me. It reminded me of a quote that I think is falsely attributed to Joseph Stalin. He said, one death is a tragedy, a million is a statistic. And where I'm going with this is that this seems to me this ties into dehumanization, because if you're telling someone a personal story, all of a sudden you become more human to that other person. I'm wondering if that ties in together like that.
100% it does. It does. So, when you tell someone a story of your vulnerability, it makes you seem more human because it makes you seem like you have a kind of rich mind capable of both experiencing emotion, right? So if you're worried about pain and suffering, that's conveying that you can feel. And it also makes you rational, which is another kind of human trait, because you're taking steps in a sense of, having a political ideology to prevent that harm in the future. And so telling these stories, we've shown in our research, makes you seem both more capable of emotion and rationality, which are, the core components of having a human mind. So you're absolutely right. And whereas telling facts, which should make you seem rational if you kind of think about it, but not really, right? Our research suggests, right? It doesn't make you seem rational or capable of having emotion because those facts seem fake. You seem diluted. You seem like sheeple, like you're just reporting talking points you heard on the news media, right? So instead, making it personal is a better way to bridge these divides.
Yeah, I experienced this in a non-political way. Just a few weeks ago, I'm a Pittsburgh Steelers fan, and that's a deeply held kind of thing. And so I was watching this show that had like Cincinnati Bengals receiver who I've never liked, and all of a sudden he was befriending this little kid with cancer, and I was just like, oh God, now I can't hate him anymore. I was kind of bummed out in a way because all of a sudden he became this human being to me as opposed to this person who just tortures my team. And I guess, but I mean that applies, it seems to me, on a political basis as well, right?
Absolutely. But you're right? That there's some dissonance here when you recognize that someone who's on, quote, the other side is also a human being, right? We like to simplify the world. And so if someone tells this powerful story or reveals that they are a person who has compassion and who's worried about protecting themselves or others, right, it humanizes them. But that can be hard from us when, in a sense, we're committed, or maybe not we, but society is often committed to this us versus them narrative. But I think it's great that, that you overcame that, right? You could have just said, I bet that kid doesn't have cancer. I mean, you'd be a monster if you said that, yeah. Right? But I think, it's great that you overcame that prejudice and, tried to see these other folks as human beings for sure.
But what was interesting to me, I guess most interesting to me, is my first reaction was, damn it. I was pissed off that I couldn't just simply and easily hate this person anymore. And so, but I guess that's part of the problem, right? Is because it's harder to work through that cognitive dissonance, and it really takes a certain effort for most folks, I would expect.
I mean, that's a great point. And I think this is where we are in America today, right? Like, it's easy to hate the conflict entrepreneurs and our different media environments have made it so simple to kind of be angry and outraged at the other side. And it takes, skills and an active will, in a sense, to really try to humanize the other side and try to bridge this gulf.
Yeah. And in terms of bridging this gulf, you have this framework you call CIV, connect, invite, and validate. Can you talk about what that is and how it works?
Sure. So I put it together just to try to help people have conversations, right? I mean, it's one thing just to tell deeply personal stories of suffering, but that's really hard, right? You're on the subway. I mean, I wouldn't have these conversations on the subway, actually, just to be clear. But let's say, you're on the plane, you're sitting next to someone for a few hours, you think they might have voted differently. How do you kind of get into these conversations? Or at Thanksgiving, right? You've got an uncle who you haven't seen in a year. How do you kind of start to have these conversations that doesn't start in a way of just like, I can't believe you did this. How would you do this? Right? Like, that's not the way to have a positive interaction. And so the framework is CIV, as you mentioned, connect, invite, validate. So connect is just before you talk about politics, connect as a human being, right? Like, this is another person. And so treat them like another person. Don't dehumanize them, right? Think about, how they're doing. What are their hopes? What are their fears? when I was just at a New Year's party and I asked people, like, what are you most excited for in the new year? Right. Which really gets at someone's like not deepest desires, but their hopes for the upcoming year. And someone I talked to, I'm not sure what his politics are, but he said, I'm really excited for a bunch of SpaceX launches. I didn't even know there was a bunch of SpaceX launches, But now, whether he votes left or right, I now see him as more of a human being who's, got this like passion since he was a kid about spaceflight. And so I think when you start these conversations, ask questions about someone's hobbies, about, what they're really looking forward to or concerned about, right? That's connect. And so now I've seen them as this person as a person. The I is invite. So don't demand. Everyone likes to be invited to a party. I like to say no one likes to be demanded to come to a party. Say, I think you maybe, have different thoughts about politics than I do. I'm really trying to understand. I like the word understand a lot. I'm really trying to understand your kind of thoughts and views. And if you could, I'd like to invite you to kind of tell me about what you're thinking about, politics or why you voted for this person and your thoughts behind it. Right. That's really different than saying, tell me, explain to me, I deserve an explanation for your vote. Right. And so the intention behind that invitation is understanding. And so you also want to give someone a chance to say no, right? And you can say, look, I know it's not easy to explain or to talk about these things. Happy to talk about them later if you prefer, right? Because then it's really an invitation, because an invitation you can say no. And then hopefully someone feels comfortable sharing what they believe. And I should say they're going to say something offensive, right? Because we're all going to say something offensive to someone because we're all kind of steeping in these talking points. Like if you're talking about abortion, someone will probably say baby killer or hate women, right? Depending on what side. Like you need to have some grace here. And so the next step is to validate the V of CIV. So someone explains kind of what they're thinking, and then maybe your first impulse is to kind of argue back. Wrong, right? You want to validate their decision to share. It doesn't mean agree. It means saying, thanks, I understand that's hard to share. We live in a tough environment to talk about politics. Here's what I think you're saying, right? I think what you're saying when it comes to, abortion is here's why you're pro-life or here's why you're pro-choice, and try to reframe that kind of discussion point in a way that they would be happy to have you summarize. And they would say, yeah, that's right. That's what I feel, and thank you for putting that into your own words. And then you can have a much better conversation. And I've used this kind of framework to have much better conversations about politics to understand people. Now, I want to say you can't go in these conversations looking to win.
Yeah.
If you're trying to win, you've already lost. You're like, oh, like, here's a chance. Like at the end of this conversation, someone's going to be like, you know what? I was wrong about abortion. I was wrong about Trump or Kamala, right? No one ever has had a conversation about morality where they're like, oh, you know what? You're so right.
Yeah, exactly.
That one thing you said.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And so, it's very frustrating. I try to do this, and I think a lot of folks who are teachers or professors, students will sometimes say something, and as a professor, you can't just say, wow, that was dumb, Bob. You have to try to validate, find something in what they're saying to validate. Well, that's an interesting point about X, and maybe we can talk about that. But that is so difficult to do. Even today, I find it really difficult to do, especially online. When you said that, my first reaction is almost always to, if one of my views is being challenged, I want to push back. And it really takes a lot to just take a breath, stop, and say, okay, how can I approach this in a way where I'm not trying to win, but where I'm trying to understand? And that really requires a lot, doesn't it?
It does require a lot. And, I didn't realize, I think it's a great point about the professorness, because you're totally right. I teach a class about this, and, whenever someone has a view that I think, it is something I don't have, I have to be very gracious, right, as a professor. And I think bringing that into, my life outside of the classroom, I think has been useful too. But you're certainly right, on social media, it's very hard. And I just think in general, people shouldn't engage in these conversations, or really arguments is what they turn into be, on social media, because text-based platforms where the algorithms are designed to incite outrage are not the places to have conversations, are not the places to foster understanding. So I agree, it's totally hard to do that on something like Twitter.
Yeah. Another thing that occurred to me in thinking about your book and these kind of differences is that some folks, I would expect, especially on the right, perhaps, would say, well, in the past, when we were much more of a religious Judeo-Christian sort of country, that we had this sort of common basis and, this idea that, right, every human being is valuable, this kind of basic respect. And as we moved away from sort of religiosity in this country, that we've lost some of this. And that's part of the reason why we have so many of these more intractable, almost seemingly I can speak, intractable political battles. And I'm wondering, how do you think religion, or the lack thereof, might play into this?
I think the short answer is that it's complicated.
Yeah.
So I've, studied the psychology of religion for some time. And, I think you can separate, and this has been done in the research, this kind of, deep spiritual ideals from the kind of more religion as a social system. And so a lot of work reveals that if you think about, the golden rule, which exists in all sorts of cultures, right? Like really getting people to accept that and to think about that increases people's willingness to accept differences and see all people as worthy of value, right? Like the Good Samaritan parable, turning the other cheek, all these really powerful lessons from Christianity, I think, help people expand their moral circle. But then there's also the kind of, narrowing of the moral circle that comes with taking these kind of spiritual ideals and making them a human system, a human group. And, every religious tradition, recognize that humans are flawed, right? To the fact that, like, I'm this kind of Methodist and you're a different kind of Methodist, right? Like we slice these group divisions so finely that it's easy to create divisions when it comes to any kind of ideals. So I think, hewing close to these kind of like deep ideals is great, as long as we don't kind of pervert it through the lens of like, my group has it right and your group has it wrong.
Yeah. I always like to close on as much of an optimistic note as I can. And clearly, when it comes to political discourse in this country, things are as bad as I've ever seen them, and as bad as they've been in quite a while, I'd say in generations at least. But how optimistic are you that we'll be able to, we're never going to eliminate this stuff, but ideally maybe just pull back a little bit from this and find ways to disagree without seemingly wanting to tear each other apart? What gives you cause, if any, for optimism?
Well, I think there's a few sources of optimism that I have. One, I think most people don't want to be so divided, and they don't want to be so outraged. I think the majority of Americans are part of something called the exhausted majority. This is a report from the organization More in Common. Most people, right, are just tired of all the yelling. They just want to go about their lives and have what's best for themselves and their family and society. So most people aren't conflict entrepreneurs. Most people just want to live their lives. So that gives me hope. I think, too, there's so many organizations, so many groups out there that are trying to create better discourse, to bridge divides, and they're really picking up steam. I belong to something called the New Pluralists, which are organizations from across the left and the right that are really trying to kind of change how we have discussions, change how we do government. And, I think there's a lot of momentum there as well. So I think both from the kind of grassroots and this kind of like top-down way, there's lots of folks who are trying to bridge divides. Of course, we've got divided Congress, we've got conflict entrepreneurs, we've got social media. And so there are kind of reasons why you could be pessimistic, but I always like to see the hope shining through these times, especially, our individual desire to connect with each other and to kind of rebuild our relationships that we've maybe lost over the last few election cycles.
Definitely. All right. Well, on that optimistic note, we will close. Kurt, great. Thanks so much for taking the time to talk with me today.
Thanks very much for having me.
Thanks for listening to this Politics Guys interview. If you're not already a supporter of the show, I hope you'll consider becoming one, because without our supporters, we wouldn't be able to do this. And when you become a supporter, you get not just that warm, fuzzy feeling knowing that you're supporting a good cause. I like to think we're a good cause, but you also get stuff like ad-free versions of everything we put out. You get our supporter exclusive midweek show, the full length of that, not just the preview. And you also get to be part of our Discord group if you want. And there's always some interesting conversations going on there. At the $10 a month level or more, you get to actually be part of the episodes Jay and I do, if that's something you're interested in. So there's a lot of stuff, is what I am saying. And I hope you'll consider checking it out. And to do that, just go to patreon.com/politicsguys. If you want to support us on Venmo, we're at Politics Guys. You can also support the show through PayPal. And all of our support links are always in the show notes, as well as at politicsguys.com/support. And as always, I want to close with a very special thank you to our wonderful executive producers, Bruce Johnson, Wilma Moreno, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, and Don Oglesby.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,